Yes, hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette 82, and we are up and running, it looks, where we read philosophy papers because, well, I don't know why, because we're under quarantine and it's rotting our brain. So, we shall try to unrot our brains by reading philosophy papers. I wonder why there's no unrot. Yeah, we don't unrot. It's an interesting question. Why is there no unrot? Alright, I can only, replace, but you can't unrot. I'm sure there's some super deep thing behind that. Alright, so let's just go look at what is new. Alter Revue de Phenomenologie. So we got, like, what's this? French phenomenologists. We've got more analysis. I can't really stop myself from reading analysis papers. So this is from On Evidence in Philosophy. But unfortunately it is not available, so we will not read that. Axiomates, quantum epistemology from mimicry to ambiguity. The epistemology of I think I've read something from Axiomates once. It was a little technical and it scared me. It's hard to read technical work over the air because you're just be like, and then X, Y equals B, C, and you can't get all the subscripts and everything. So let's see, what do we got? This is 6 pages, so let's see if this is available. No. Let's just check the publisher. No. Ain't spending $40 to read some philosophy. Sorry. I will go to the hub of science if need be. Like I'm sure these papers are all super interesting. I just can't read something on 3-valued logics over the air. It's not going to work. City and the Soul, and Al-Farabi. That's 14 pages. It's getting kind of long. If I get something on the shorter end of things. The Paradigm Crisis of Modern Mainstream Economics. Dilemma for Mathematical Constructivism. So, let's see. Not obviously available. This one is available, so let's take a quick look in that case. See how we are looking. Alright, so it's not like super small font. But if it gets all math in like a second, I can't do it. This is doable. Oh, yeah, see there's math, all these mathy formulas in here. Yeah, I don't want to read so much math today. Sorry. So, was the, let's see if this is, available. Nope. Okay, so, I'm tired of it. Alright, you lose out then, Axiomates. Bakhtiniana. Bakhtiniana, okay. Alright, so we've got, this is a Brazilian journal on Bakhtin. Interesting. BioEssays, what do we got? Looks like a lot of stuff came out in BioEssays. But I can't, the page numbers are busted here, so I'm not going to click through them to find out. Biology and philosophy. A long time ago I tried to get something in here. Did not go well. Alright, so that's one. 1 to 16, 1 to 5. Proportion. Why is this only 1 to 5? But I'll take a look. Process of defending biodiversity. Yeah. Biodiversity. Maybe this was a special thing. And the holobiont. Pathogen versus microbiome. I'm gonna have so much trouble reading any of this stuff. Okay, all these complicated words. But it's not available. Is this like the same people? What is this? Yes, it looks like oh, not the same people. But it's not available. So what are you gonna do? And then this one is also not. Oh, come on, peoples. Help a lowly person over here out that doesn't have like institutional access to these things. What are you gonna do? How am I supposed to read a philosophy paper? Alright, that's a... I mean, I will be forced to go back to analysis and just read one of their papers if no one else does it. I think I did this, yeah. Oh, there's a correction to the I read the does artistic, but I put a special problem for time travel theories. Let's go see if this is available, just to see what it says. If there's any way to like find out what the mistake was that they made in that article. Oh, the footnote number was wrong. Okay, there was a mistake in a footnote. No big deal. Alright, this is a review. Beauty, ugliness, and free play of imagination. That could be cool. Aptness of fiction-directed emotions. That's 14 pages. I want to avoid 14 pages if possible. Okay, well, I can't read your paper if it's not available. Wait, there's a review at the bottom. Optical revolution, but it's 43 downloads. It tends to indicate... Oh. Shucks. But there's no... It's gonna be... You know what? How long is this? I don't know. It doesn't have page numbers on it. Let's just take a quick look. I fear it'll be too long. Let's see. 1 of 8. No, this can be done. This can be done. Let's re-download this. Okay, cool. So I guess what we're doing is Van Eyck an optical revolution. Oh, I hope this isn't. Oh, it's a review of an exhibition, so we're not doing this. Sorry, Benz. I've done a paper from Benz before. Yeah, this doesn't have any page numbers on it, so I'm gonna have to just let it go. Complexity is too complex. Critical discourse studies, dialogos. Is this more, you know, the Brazilian speaking world has an awful lot of good philosophy coming out of it, so it'd be good to know Portuguese. Did I just say the Brazilian speaking world? I did. The Brazilians have a lot of good philosophy. I'm sure the Portuguese do too, and it's all Portuguese. Okay, so this one is 15 pages. Let's see if I can get something a little shorter. This is 13. This is 12. 5. Here we go, but approaches to discourses of marriage. Alright, well, if it's available. Not available. It is available. Let's just see if this is a, this looks like a review. Yeah, because we're talking about the British Association of Applied Linguistics and stuff. Let's just say collection, yeah. This is the editor's note at the beginning of the paper, the journal article. So let's see what else we have. Reviews. Doing critical discourses with multimodality of reply. I don't know what this means, but I'll take a look. It's 8 pages. Yeah, not available. Alright, I'm tired of having to look through this stuff. What else? I hope everyone is having a good day. Urgentness. Let's see what urgentness has. I read this horizontal surgicality. That was an interesting thing about how to line up theories with causation. Alright. See if we got anything of particular interest. Passing time. Is that like passing gas? Ooh, that's a cute picture. He's got like a bunch of his kids around him, I guess it would be. Boo, not available. So, what are we gonna do? I read this Dr. Evil. That was fun. Yeah, this is getting a little long. Those are all like 16 pages right there. Pages. 12. It takes more than more to answer existence questions. Oh, well, I have a soft spot for G.E. Moore, so please let this be available. Hooray! Oh, it's 22, but it's double spaced. Okay, that's okay. So, here we go. If you join me live, you can always get the link here by typing of the paper in question by typing in !paper into the chat box, and then the that'll pop back up. So. Good. Okay, so here we go. We do not read no abstracts. Why would we do that? Quinism and the Morean challenge. Much recent work in metametaphysics seeks to undermine what has been described as the preferred methodology for dealing with ontological questions, Quinism. There is much to be said about what exactly this approach is or should be, but one strand of agreement is that for the Kuan Yin, ontological questions are quantificational questions. Well, Kuan was always famous for saying, to be is to be the value of a bound variable. I think I got that right. That is, ontology is concerned with what we quantify over, or equivalently for the Kuan Yin what there is, or again equivalently for the Kuan Yin what exists. For a putative kind of f, we can ask of the following: are there f's? Do f's exist? Is it the case that there exists x such that f of x? Yep. However, a range of metapositions starting with Kit Fine, but including some variation with Justin Schaffer and Catherine Kozlicki, envisage a serious problem with treating questions of this form as central to ontology. They claim that for almost any reasonable candidate, the questions resulting from its substitution into the schemas above are trivially answerable in the affirmative. Take some typical examples of how to obtain these easy answers. There are prime numbers, therefore there are numbers. Properties. There are properties that you and I share, therefore there are properties. This argumentative strategy has been described by Schaffer as Morean. In each case, the premises claimed to be a Morean fact, one of those things that we know better than we know the premises of any philosophical argument to the contrary, whose truth establishes the conclusion because the conclusion is a weakening of the premise. Contrariwise, by considering whether there are numbers or propositions, the Kuan Yin is inquiring after something whose falsity would entail the falsity of a Morean fact. But, says the endorser of this strategy, it's a Morean fact. We are so confident that it is a fact that no argument to the contrary should move us. These examples do not in themselves show that the Kuan Yin approach is untenable. The central move for what I will call the triviality argument generalizes on examples, reasoning as follows. Most questions of the form "are there Fs?" that the Kuan Yin regards as interesting can, they say, be answered by appeal to Morean facts. They then claim that if such a question can be answered by appeal to a Morean fact, it is uninteresting, and therefore that the questions regarded as interesting by the Kuan Yin are, in fact, uninteresting. Well, let me finish the paragraph before making a side comment. On the assumption that an approach is flawed if it is seriously misrepresents questions it considers, the proponent of the triviality argument rejects Kuan Yinism. The first paper I did, Philosophy Roulette number 1, which is not online because I actually printed the paper out and was handwriting it, and had the video on the paper, and I was just writing stuff on it as opposed to this sort of digital presentation, was on this exact topic. So I'm remembering back, there was a very, very similar setup that they didn't talk about specifically about Quine, but this sort of setup is exactly what that paper was on. It also it took an hour and a half to get through, and it's one of the reasons I don't do that paper anymore. There are at least two simple ways that the Kuan Yin could respond. First, they might insist that there is one substitution of F for which no Morean fact undermines the existence question, but proponents of the triviality argument will be happy to issue the challenge and wait for counterexamples. If one is proposed, they may still attempt to take recourse in Morean facts, pitting their own intuitions against those of the Kuan Yin, but this is not necessary. This is because they need not hold that one can never pursue the Kuan Yin strategy. They can rest content with the more limited thesis that one should be permissive about those very entities Kuan Yins typically consider most controversial. For instance, Fine admits that that possibles may be an exception to the triviality argument because possible is a philosophical term of art about which people have no intuitions, and Schaffer claims that putative kinds will not be amenable to Morean existence proofs if their definitions presuppose their fundamentality, because he sees that as smuggling in content from other metaphysical approaches. Yeah, so if you build in weird things, but then say, well, you get that because it's a Morean fact, it's a question of what exactly the Morean fact consists in. I mean, if you're saying, well, the Morean fact has all this metaphysics in there, it seems like maybe not. Maybe the fact is somehow more limited, and your theory about the fact is really what's at issue. Neither thinks that these exceptions undermine the strategy, and this is primarily because they contend that even if there are a handful of legitimate Kuan Yin ontological questions, there are a great many more important ontological questions not addressed by that approach, making the Kuan Yin approach at best a sideshow. The contention of the Kuan Yin is supposed to be that they identify or at least the main methodology for metaphysics. The moderate response of seeking exceptions to the Morean move is therefore ineffective. The second simple Kuan Yin response is to insist that Kuan Yinism has ontology right, but to just concede that, as it turns out, there aren't really any interesting ontological questions. Typically, defenders of the triviality argument say that there obviously are interesting ontological questions, and we need to find a way to acknowledge this. So they go on to articulate some version of neo-Aristotelianism, locating the ontological project instead in questions about whether and how entities are grounded in other entities. However, versions of the triviality argument have been endorsed by philosophers who would describe themselves as deflationists, for whom the dearth of interesting ontological questions is a wholesome result. Not wholesome, welcome result. Internet is rotting my brain. From the Kuan Yin perspective, though, this would be a rather unsatisfying response. Okay, I'm going over all the sort of typical Kuan Yin Morean discussions in this area. Wonder what the point is. Well, I'm sure we'll find out. There have been sophisticated responses, though surprisingly few, to the triviality argument. For instance, Daly and Liggins argue that nothing has been done to establish the Morean status of the examples of in the triviality argument, and therefore we lack any reason to deny any countervailing considerations could be strong enough to undermine it, even if we can see that each starting premise possesses strong warrant. I've actually worked on this. I have to redo my paper. I can explain this. I think I can explain it. I will not contribute further to criticism of that premise of the triviality argument, though I think that a defense from the perspective of confirmation holism is rather persuasive. I will instead grant that for the sake of argument that the statements in question aren't Morean facts, nor am I interested in critiquing the neo-Aristotelian approach offered to replace Quineanism, both because this would do nothing to respond to the aforementioned deflationists for whom the triviality argument leads to a different conclusion, and because there is already a large and complex literature on how, if at all, we can make sense of grounding. My strategy will instead be to criticize the formulation of the Kuan Yin approach that has been used to construct the triviality argument. By failing to articulate the approach clearly, I argue these philosophers get away with ignoring better explanations of debates from the target perspective. In particular, the Kuan Yin can easily deny that it follows from the availability of an answer, are there F's, by appeal to Morean facts, that the question is uninteresting. Okay, so we finally got somewhere. That the appeal to the Morean fact, I guess, is why the title is of the paper is what it is. Will not actually answer the is it trivial, are there F's? Let's see, how could they do that? We'll find out. I got some ideas about what's going to happen, but we shall see. The presentation of this issue by proponents of the triviality argument presupposes that the Kuan Yin focus when asking ontological questions is on challenging and potentially throwing out putative kinds of entity. Accordingly, critiques of Kuan Yinism are sometimes treated in the same breath as critiques of eliminativism, with an attendant focus on the illegitimacy of eliminating from our account entities that are identified as problematic. A simple picture of this endeavor would show us starting with a list of kinds, F, G, H, I, J, ... and suspicion of, for instance, I, seeking arguments against its existence that are strong enough to jettison it from the list, clearing out the clutter from our ontology in search of a desert landscape. We eventually find ourselves with a shortened list, say FHJ. This is the endpoint Schaffer describes when explaining that the Kuan Yin conception of ontology is flat. The target of metaphysical inquiry is an unstructured list of existence E. In contrast, Schaffer's preferred view is the target of metaphysical inquiry as a hierarchy. We should end up with a structure that maps out grounding relations from the most derivative entities to the most fundamental. For him, giving a Kuan Yin ontology is much like describing a house just by listing its parts. It constitutes a poor account because we lack an explanation of the structural relations. But Schaffer is wrong to think this. Well, okay, Schaffer's wrong. Guess so. For the Kuan Yin, the target of metaphysical inquiry is not just an ontology as a list of accepted kinds, but an ontology with an accepted accompanying ideology. This notion, introduced in Quine 51, refers to one's stock of simple and complex terms or predicates, Quine 83, and concerns what can be expressed in a theory. Alongside the question of what things we say there are is the question of what notions we need in order to talk about them. Indeed, unless we rely on ostension to identify all the objects in our theory, which comes with its own serious problems, ideology is essential to our ability to formulate an ontology at all. When I make any claim about the metaphysics of F's, I better be able to explain what F's are like. I anticipate the following reply. So what? Rephrase and say the target of Kuan Yin ontology and an ontological inquiry is an unstructured list of existence. It remains true that the Kuan Yin countenances absurd possibilities, so their metaphysics collapses thanks to its reliance on a bad conception of ontology. However, the introduction of ideology in fact changes things substantially, for the Kuan Yin will regard ontology and ideology as closely related. There will be no such thing as ontological inquiry divorced from ideological inquiry, because we are constantly engaged in a complex trade-off between the two. Providing fully instructive examples proves difficult, since any dispute concerning a specific kind of K, whether something constitutes an ontological or ideological cost, will depend on what has already been accepted elsewhere in the theory. However, a reasonable example would be in the debate between Platonism and fictionalism about mathematics. Being free of numbers adds an ideological counterbalance of mathematical fiction operators, while being burdened with numbers frees us from the weight of those operators. So you're just saying it's a half of one and like half a dozen and 6 of the other. Yeah. Another might be presented by a dispute about the existence of states. One can deny that states exist, but may incur an ideological cost of explaining certain phenomena like declarations of war or state oppression. Alright, so it's like saying, basically, you're just pushing around what you're calling the problem. Either it's you have to have sophisticated objects, or you have an ideology that deals with the objects in a more sophisticated way. So it says, given that there is some theory of ideology in Quine, the problems really are just being pushed around, but they are handled in different ways. Okay. It should be borne in mind that the trade-off described above is not always direct, since we might have two theories with the same ontology but different ideologies. Yeah. Thus, we shouldn't expect an itemized list of debates with ontology or ideology affixed to each. A simple comparison would be between a theory accepting primitive modal operators and one rejecting them, assuming there was no difference in ontology between the two. This would mean that the latter theory was forced to reject all modal language. Of course, in this case, barring serious reasons for doubt about modal idioms as a whole, the comparison that would occupy metaphysicians for longer is that between modality as ideology, in terms of operators, and as ontology, in terms of possible worlds. Yeah, so you're just, you're shifting your problems, basically, between different metaphysical theories, but they're not going away. It's just how you're sort of conceiving of your problems. Furthermore, this reveals the character of the misrepresentation of Kuan Yinism. The Kuan Yin metaphysical project is one of explication. Specifically, if we want to be truly Kuan Yin, explication of all our serious linguistic behavior. A formulation of which Quine approved glosses this as making more exact a vague and not quite exact concept used in everyday life. We are generally not looking for dubious kinds to throw out of our account of the world because they fail to meet some authoritative standard of reality. We are seeking to clarify our account of the world as we understand it and seeking what kinds are needed to do so. To paraphrase the now cliché Kuan Yin quip, the relevant 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables are there F's, but what is there? If we imagine the inquirer as progressively introducing language ranging over different kinds of entity until able to achieve with their theory everything that we can in fact achieve, the question of elimination would not come up, or would at best be secondary to the constructive project. This is not to say that for Quine the project is essentially constructive, but rather that on Quine's view we could choose either way, constructive or destructive, of framing the very same project. More on this later. Ooh. Okay, fine. If it's really just explication, then there's I guess that's fair. I don't know enough of I haven't done enough reading in this area, but if it's fundamentally explication the way this author says, you might get different problems by switching to this just what is there, but that's okay. We'll find out what more is going on here. Not G.E. Moore. What more? This way of considering things might seem to make no difference, in part because of a well-known passage of Quine where he states that explication is elimination, but not all elimination is explication. This suggests on first reading that explication is for him a subtype of elimination, and therefore that elimination is the category of real interest. This view would have it that explication simply reduces to a special case of elimination. However, what Quine goes on to say on this matter is informative, since the determining factor in whether an elimination counts as an explication is how far usage before the project maps onto usage after it. As an explication is how far usage before the project maps on to the usage after it. Okay. This is a difference of degree than a difference in kind, and this is significant because most would regard explication as a different sort of project from elimination. Yeah. Okay, whatever. It's details of explication under Quine. The fact that Quine regards them as the same sort of project reveals his attitude, that we cannot think of ourselves as trying to pick out which of our terms correspond to the real things, but rather we must think of ourselves as engaged in a project of identifying good ways to construct a theory. We say elimination when the good way we find is radically different from the way we started. We say explication when the good way we find isn't isn't offensive to our starting position. This difference in phrasing is not because there are two projects, there is just one which can be described in multiple ways. However, we seek to characterize it differently depending on features displayed in the part of the project we're engaged in, out of appreciation for the fact that a successful explication will often involve a partial parallelism of function between the old way in speaking and the new way. The two characterizations are useful for picking apart when an account shows less or more of such parallelism. So I guess it just means that if we had things mostly right to begin with, then you're explicating, you're just sharpening up the content, the concepts. If we had things kind of wrong when we actually look into things, then you have to eliminate the old theory and sort of make a new one. But it's the same sort of a project of just sharpening everything up. In saying this, I am rejecting the view espoused implicitly by many writing about Kuan Yin methodology that Kuan's central concern is not explication but regimentation. Regimentation is different. That regimentation cannot capture the Kuan Yin project should be clear. After regimenting our language, we will be left with the question of which theory best achieves our goals, and we would be remarkably fortunate to find that the way in which we tidied up the usage turned out to be most useful. When we find ourselves in this position, our best recourse will be in explication. Of course, we should accept the constructive view is not the one we typically take when we do ontology. Given the inevitable complexity of whatever overall theory we arrive at, we typically start by identifying problematic kinds in the theory that we bring to the table, and this might be taken to place eliminativism front and center again. However, to see why focusing on elimination is still misleading, we can turn to the notion of explaining and explaining away, on which Kuan's stance is notably similar to the above. These are often treated as distinct, and in at least one sense they certainly are. Something might be described as having been explained when that explanation is only partial. For instance, my being hungry explains why I'm looking through the fridge, even though it is by no means a complete explanation of my looking through the fridge. Excuse me. I am hungry a lot of the time, and only most of the time does it result in rifling through the fridge. Okay, so this person thinks they have a sense of humor. It was a little bit funny. I'll grant them that. In contrast, nothing would be regarded as explained away without being completely so. I do not count on having explained away the ghost at the fairground if I can account for all spooky goings-on as action taken by a nefarious property developer who wants it shut down except for the sighting that took place while she was out of town. Yeah, what are you, Scooby-Doo? However, if we countenance only complete explanations, it's less clear that the two notions are distinct for the true Kuan Yin, and their difference is simply one of emphasis. On the project to eliminate mental entities, Kuan writes, the reduction of the mental to the physical can be characterized in either of two ways, as explaining or as explaining away. There is no difference, but the first phrasing has a gentler ring. To have repudiated the life of the mind seems harsher than to have explained it in physical terms. If explaining and explaining away are in all important respects equivalent, then as Gustafsson points out, the same follows for elimination and identification, and this means that Kuan is an eliminativist only in a rather unusual sense of the word, if at all. Focusing on elimination is therefore misleading. It privileges a less natural statement of the situation over a statement given in terms congenial to the intuitions that the triviality argument seeks to exploit. Okay, so this, I guess, is the whole point of this section. Focusing on elimination is misleading. It privileges a less natural statement of the situation over a statement given in terms congenial to the intuition that the triviality argument. Okay, so let's just see how this works out. No more argument. We can now clearly show how the proponent of the triviality argument misrepresents the Kuan Yin approach in the key cases. Recall properties. The argument strategy looks effective because it challenges the Kuan Yin to dare consider questioning aware that to do so seems to be to entertain the possibilities of rejection by modus tollens of a Morian fact. Suppose that one is a Morian fact. It nonetheless does not follow that the argument shows the Kuan Yin approach to treat trivial points as substantial because the fact's Morian status does not by any means fix its analysis. Moore himself was aware of this. He claimed to refute idealism and prove the existence of an external world by appeal to the Moorean fact expressed by "I know I have hands." But while he thought this sufficient for his purposes, he remained very skeptical as to what, in certain respects, the correct analysis of such propositions is. Okay, so hopefully more explanation here. Given, therefore, that we remain open to analysis, there is nothing to rule out the following extension to properties. Properties are just sets, therefore there are no properties over and above sets. This is an eliminative argument, assuming that we have accepted sets because we remove the commitment to any entity above and beyond a set of objects sharing a feature, but it does not deny a Moorean fact. By presenting the argument as explaining what properties are, we preserve the truth of 2. We, of course, need some argument for accepting 3, but that lies beyond my remit. I have no stake here in the status of properties and sets in particular. So they're saying that this sort of eliminative argument. Alright, so what page are we on? We're on page 12. Go all the way up through all this Kuan Yin stuff. Okay, so therefore there are properties. This is a good question, actually. Why do you think that properties that you and I share is a Moorean fact? Like, this is a hand. Here's a hand. Hand. Everyone see hand? Stick, stupid. Stick. No, hand. Okay, this is hand. This is not, properties are like an abstract thing. When Moorean facts obtain, usually it's more of an everyday sort. So I'm already a little worried about how the progression of this argument is going here, because you can see they started with a much more abstract thing than a hand. They started with properties, and again they started with numbers. Numbers are a bit more Moorean than properties, but even so, it's not like here the number is 7. The number 7 is prime, therefore there are numbers. That would be a much more Moorean statement. So I'm a little worried that this defense of Quine against Moore is misrepresenting Moore, even as they say that the Moorean has misrepresented Quine. So to continue this argument as the way they're doing is to show eliminativism about not a Moorean fact, but of some abstract thing. So if you assume these are Moorean facts, which I don't think you should, then their argument probably goes through. But I don't know why you would accept 1 and 2 as a sort of a Moorean argument. Okay, so that's my worry about this right here. Because if you're going to go to that 3, the eliminativism on 3, as they say over here, then I think that's because you've actually started with a non-Moorean thing, properties. I mean, if you go and look at the Moore's thing, where he starts to just sort of expound a list of things that he counts as Moorean facts, properties not on them. It's like, here's a hand, that I had breakfast this morning, that the earth is like round maybe, I don't know. But like, it's not like properties. It's not yeah. Like, there are properties that you and I share? No, you'd say, well, there are, like, we both have a red hat. That would be the Moorean fact. Like, I have a red hat, you have a hat, we have red hats. Then if you go abstracting to properties, like, we both have, we have the property of having hats, that's very different. Okay. Alright, so by presenting the argument as explaining what properties are, we preserve the truth of 2. Yes, but you see, the Moorean fact, it does not deny the Moorean fact, but that's because you may have attributed Moorean facthood to something that wasn't a Moorean fact, and then you're going on from there. Okay, let's continue. The Kuan Yin's opponent might think that they have a legitimate gripe with 4, which is therefore there are no properties over and above sets, saying that if we are to understand nothing over and above claims, we need to make use of a serious notion of grounding. This line of thought would have it that 4 means something like properties are grounded in sets. Since the Kuan Yin will not engage in such questions, they cannot employ premises like 4, so the argument will go. However, the Kuan Yin can reasonably point out that they don't mean anything special by statements like 4. For them, this is a matter of phrasing that indicates a close connection between explicatum and explicandum that might be seen as in other cases. It has no special context beyond a statement like there is no such person as Superman over and above Clark Kent, where it is understood that as a way of saying that they are the same person. Depending on the confusion one seeks to clear up, another way, so they're saying it's just a semantic problem. It's not the dicto de re issue here. There is no Superman, just Clark Kent. Though we might avoid this phrasing for fear of suggesting that the subject's superpowers were spurious. Well, you could then just say there is no Clark Kent, just Superman. The inclusion of ideology in our inquiry demonstrates further how such extinctions can leave an interesting question. For example, for an easy example demonstrating its relevance, couples. Some couples are closer than others, therefore there are couples. Couples are just two people seeking to satisfy the predicate XX are together. Therefore, there are no couples over and above people quantified over plurally. There are no couples over people quantified plurally. That would see, well, I guess this is just like false. But, because if they're together, that has some meaning there. So there are no couples over and above quantified plurally is just false. I mean, that would just be like groups of people are no people. There are no groups of people over and above people quantified over plurally, maybe, but yeah. Whether this is an acceptable argument turns on questions of ideology. If we count both plural and single quantification, we can account for couples in ideological terms, but if we do not regard plural quantification as basic, a different strategy must be employed, which doesn't say there are good examples of such strategies. You see, that's weird, because, I mean, what I just said was this makes the 4 is just false, because it ignores couples are just two people satisfying a predicate, but then 4 doesn't follow from 3. So this is a weird example. Sorry. But I mean, of course, what the author here is trying to say is, I mean, of course, then you've got plural quantification, and there's like details here as basic, and you've got ideology of like how would predication over plurals work, things like that, which is fine. Those are also important questions, but it's sort of like missing the Morean fact for the ideology here. It's like, this is not the Morean fact. Like, okay, the proponent of the triviality argument, on the other hand, cannot avoid an ontologically committing interpretation of there are couples, because there are of the heavyweight interpretation of the Morean fact. Indeed, Fine endorses this move explicitly and thereby invites questions about fundamentality and ground with respect to couples. Others might insist that couples involves no Morean fact, but it is hard to know how this might be defended without undermining Moreanness of properties, insofar as both arguments just appeal to ordinary language. See, this is the thing. The properties thing, I don't think counts as Morean fact. This is maybe a derivative of it. So the argument here is appealing to a sort of a Quinian interpretation of Morean facts. But that's okay. Like the couples there, other man says that couples is no Morean fact. Well, what is this whole thing I deny is a Morean fact. Some couples are closer than others. Well, sure, maybe you count that as a Morean fact, and there are couples, that's fine. But then moving to this one is that's the properties argument 3 and 4, and I think that's illegitimate in this case, because the properties move is not like a Morean sort of argument. It's a different argument. Okay, but it's, if you sort of if you're looking at it from that perspective, it seems like a reasonable thing to do. A task remains for us, though. How can we understand the apparent contrast between explaining and explaining away? On the Quinian picture, why would we prefer one's characterization over the other? The quote above discouraging any serious distinction between the two suggested that this question is not worth asking, but such a dismissal is only uncontroversial from within the Quinian framework. In the fact of the external challenge posed by the triviality argument, it is important that we say more to motivate the Quinian view of the relationship between the notions. Quine is not always helpful in this respect. At least in the passage above, he prefers to describe the physical as explaining the mental, while he describes classes as explaining away the natural numbers, but dedicates little space to justifying the distinction. The considerations he offers relate to the presence of alternative analyses. We have a fairly stable physical story that purports to do the explanatory work of the mental. While numbers can be successfully identified with various different structures, so distaste for saying that 2 is the class of all pairs and the class containing exactly 0 and 1 leads him to prefer the eliminative characterization. However, we can give more general reasons to choose between the formulations that demonstrates why the Kuan Yin does not err in considering them more or less equivalent. This will show why, though Kuan is remiss for insufficiently explaining his rejection of a serious distinction, the oversight is understandable. The result falls out of his basic methodology. As mentioned above, the Kuan Yin is engaged in a project of explication based on the broad base of language use that we must take to be correct to make sense of anything at all. We attempt to clarify what we're talking about in a way that goes beyond our mere speech behavior. The outcome of explication will sometimes be surprising from the standpoint of the naive defender of a putative kind, and sometimes will not, and this in turn will often have a great deal with the role played by the original term in our theory. When the outcome furnishes surprises, explaining away is the natural characterization of a successful theory, while when it doesn't, it is best seen as merely explaining. Yet again, though this does not bespeak a sharp, principled difference. Bespeak, I haven't seen that in a while. For instance, suppose we are inquiring about the universals and we find that the phenomena they are employed to explain are dealt with adequately by existence of sets. Defenders of universals would typically say that we should believe in universals because without entities possessing their distinct features, we cannot make sense of talk about shared features at all. So if phenomena in question, shared features, are adequately explained by sets, it would be strange to retain the term of our universal and say that, as it turns out, universals are just sets. Universals are just our sets. Compare this to a superficially similar inquiry about properties. In this situation, where were we to find sets sufficient to explain the phenomena for which properties seem necessary, again talk of shared features, it would be more natural to regard or account as explaining what properties are, because nothing substantial or controversial is intimately associated with the term. It wouldn't be unreasonable to hold the concept property to pick out whatever explains the co-attribution of predicates. The proponent of the triviality argument will perhaps protest that we have not really shown how the Kuan Yin can have an interesting ontological project. It is not my task to do so fully here, as demonstrating this would require substantial further commitments. My aim has been to show, without relying on any particular contentious ontological claims, that one may accept Morean facts advanced by the triviality argument without conceding that the Kuan Yin approach must then fail by treating as questionable that which is certain. However, we have seen, albeit briefly, how the Kuan Yin can have an interesting ontological inquiry. Assuming a Morean fact that says or entails there are F's, here's a hand, there are hands. Okay. The wider Kuan Yin ontological project becomes relevant to questions about the kind of F when we ask whether there are statements in our prospective theory. Morean or otherwise, the forms there are G's, such that we could plausibly identify the kinds F and G. To gesture at how the project will continue, we can look to ideology, both in the basic sense of our accepted logical notions and in a wider sense. For instance, once we have accepted there are properties, there remains the question of what predicates apply to those entities. For instance, should we hold that the predicate X resides in Platonic heaven applies to them? Our eliminative extension to properties would then turn the question about the predicate on to the sets themselves, a simple example of the interaction of the ontological and ideological projects. I have not provided details of how one would resolve these further questions, but again, it is not my task here, especially as it might undermine our current neutrality between various approaches to ontology. Okay, fine. So it's like, look, you can the Kuan accepts that. The Kuan Yin can accept that the Morean fact. Now, does that matter? Does that mean that there's no interesting questions to ask? Well, the author here has gone on to show that you can still ask interesting ontological questions about explication and then explaining away in the case where you have to accept some sort of Morean fact, but then you have to do some Kuan Yin stuff over here with the properties, and then you can explain stuff away, because that would mean you just didn't have the Morean fact maybe clear enough to begin with, and then so you're sharpening up the Morean fact So you're explicating the Morian fact, and that would be of value to somehow clarify what it is to be a hand. And then if you explicate what it is to be a hand more, then you have actually you've actually done something useful. So there could still be the sharpening up and not explaining it away. Because if you explain it away, then you are wrong about your Morian fact. But that could happen too. Morians shouldn't be completely dogmatic about their facts. Okay, conclusion. I conclude that the triviality argument does not show that the Kuan Yin approach to be fatally flawed, even if we grant the assumption that a wide range of existence statements are Morian facts. The Kuan Yin can, in cases that do not clash with core usage, regard an account as merely explaining the entities involved by identifying them with other entities or by showing them to be ideological constructions. Yeah, that's fine. Although I suspect the Kuan Yins really won't like this. This person did a lot of work to clarify Kuan's perspective here, and so the Kuan Yins would have to sort of glom onto the author's version of Kuan to accept this sort of this conclusion. If they do, then it's okay, but it feels like it's not as unique, and it sort of waters it down to just be sort of, instead of all things all to be like all out to be is X and F, then you're saying, well, what is there? What is there is a much weaker statement. It's sort of much more general, and then you're not getting such a strong sort of flavor, a Kuan Yin flavor out of it, or what people think to be Kuan Yin flavor. So granted, maybe the author may be 100% right about everything they said about Kuan, but I don't know if that will be rhetorically strong or sociologically impressive to the Kuan Yins out there who want to retain a strong Kuan Yin flavor to their theorizing, or at least what they think Kuan said. Because if you sort of take away the strong stance, then it doesn't set it apart as much from other philosophies, really. So we've got two things here. You've got the story about Kuan. Will people accept that? Now, that's not a strictly philosophy. It's more of a sociological question about rhetoric and sociology of Kuan Yin scholars. I don't know how that will actually go. The second point I would make is the real understanding of Morian facts is I don't actually buy because of this properties thing here. You have to presuppose something about the kind of thing Morian facts are, and Moore was careful not to do that, and how to analyze these things. And so from even what Moore was saying about I have hands, and then in certain respects correct analysis of the proposition, but you can see very quickly that I know I have hands does not go and give you like properties right there. Like, really, why would that be the case? Like, that'd be kind of nuts. Like, why would I know I have hands and then call properties a Morian fact, or like some sort of Morian derivation? Yeah, so I think that's a question I'd have for the author. So otherwise, nice paper. It does a good job in putting forward a Kuan Yin position that seems reasonable against this sort of question. So, okay, I hope everyone has a good day. I'll be back later. And stay safe, y'all, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.